Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. As we do our Old Testament and New Testament reading today, we find a tie between the two. In both of our readings, we have the Kidron Valley and the brook of the Kidron brought out in the stories, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, it's in the context of Hezekiah and the reforms connected to Hezekiah. They're about to engage in the Passover, and so the people take the altars and the incense altars that were previously used for idol worship in Jerusalem. They took them and they threw them into the Kidron Valley, into the brook of Kidron. And so that was a way in which they removed the idols from Jerusalem. When we get to John chapter 15 with the story of Jesus, we see that in the midst of Jesus' sufferings, as he is about to go into the very heart of suffering there in Gethsemane, he travels through the ravine of the Kidron. In chapter 18, verse 1, it says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden in which he entered with his disciples." As we know that in that garden, he was under immense trial. He was emotionally wrought. His sweat was sweat like drops of blood. And it's there that he began his sufferings that would continue all the way through the cross. And so you have a tie between this destruction of the idols and then also the suffering and the sorrow of Christ. And I think these two things go hand in hand. Oftentimes we think of times of sorrow, of difficulty, of suffering as always a bad thing. And certainly it is bad in the sense that it's unpleasant. It's something that we don't desire. Usually comes at us in a way that we don't expect. It's not pleasant, but sometimes it does work out some good in our lives, in that it drives out the idols that are within. Just as they took the idols out of Jerusalem, these altars, these incense altars that were used for idol worship, and they threw it into the Kidron, into the brook of the Kidron, and drove them out. And as Christ entered into that area as well with his disciples in sorrow and suffering, we see that when we encounter these particular situations in which we have to enter into our own season, into our own Gethsemane, our own season of suffering, that the idols are driven out. This is spoken about in 1 Peter chapter 4. In 1 Peter chapter 4, this is what the Apostle Peter said, and he was there with Jesus as he went into the brook Kidron. But he says there in verse 1, he says, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same purpose." So Christ suffered in the flesh. He said, arm yourself with the same purpose as Christ. "Because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lust of men, but for the will of God." Peter understood that suffering in the flesh had an effect on people and continues to have an effect on people. As people suffer in the flesh, it drives out the desires of the flesh so that a person can give themselves wholly to the will of God. Suffering is to the soul what fasting is to the body. Fasting is a time in which you refrain from food. Some people refrain from food and drink. There's a lot of different ways to fast, but typically it's just, refraining from intaking certain types of food and drink. And what that does is it tempers the flesh, and it tells the body that it's not in control. It allows a person to even forego something as basic as eating and drinking so that they can focus on God, and it has that effect. But suffering has a similar effect on our mind and in our heart, because it has kind of the same thing in that it pushes us away from our desires. Whenever you're suffering, if you've ever gone through depression or deep sorrow, or just dealing with something that caused a lot of anxiety in your heart, typically in those seasons, if you can remember, in those seasons, typically you weren't worried about sinning and going about in the lust of the flesh and doing all these things. You were completely focused on that particular problem. And if you were in a relationship with God at that time, you were focused on that particular problem. You were bringing it before the Lord. You were seeking out the Lord. You were desiring the things of the Lord, and that the power of the Lord would work in that particular situation. And your peripheral narrowed, and you focused in on that particular problem and bringing it to God. And sufferings have a way of doing that. And so sufferings can drive out all the excess in our hearts, drive out all the extra things that crowd our heart, that rob room from God, that takes the place and sits on the throne of our hearts where Christ himself should only sit. And sorrow drives all that away. And this sorrow can be just things that happen to us in life. That definitely happens. Things just come to us without us having any control over it. But it also could be a sorrow that we create, in that it could be the sorrow that comes in connection to repentance and sorrow for sin. If we're having trouble with a particular sin that continually infects us, continually clings to us, and we just can't seem to let it go, it might just be that we haven't had the proper sorrow over that sin as we should. And we haven't really seen that sin in the light of truly what it is, a destructive force in our lives. And it might just be that until we truly have sorrow over that sin, it's not just in a very shallow way saying to the Lord, "Oh Lord, forgive me of this sin," and then going about our lives, but really zeroing in on it, having true sorrow over that sin might be just what we need to drive out that sin or those sins that continually come at us. And it could be anything in our lives that's really robbing the place of God, of having the full authority in our lives. It could be things that are just replacing God, that aren't necessarily sinful in and of themselves, but become sinful because we're using them to replace God. If we're having trouble getting rid of those things, we ought to perhaps approach them from the standpoint of sorrow. It's being sorrowful over the fact that we're allowing something of this earth, of this world, to take the place of our beloved Father in heaven. And to meditate on that and think about that, it might just be that would be a driving force to push that idol out of our hearts. So as we do our reading today, let's kind of hold these two things together. Our Old Testament reading, where we see these these altars and incense altars that were used for idol worship being thrown in the Kidron, the brook of the Kidron, and then also Christ entering into suffering in the flesh, there also in the valley of the Kidron. And let's draw these two things together and really take to heart what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 4 about this suffering of the flesh being a way in which we drive out the lusts and the desires of the flesh and are able to truly seek out the will of God. So that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.